Hi, I'm Donald Clegg. I'm here to help you avoid some of the perils and pitfalls of watercolor. During the years I've been painting, I think I've made just about every conceivable mistake, and I'd like to help you avoid some of them. We're going to get going with a simple study of a couple of pears. Let's get started. Whenever I'm looking at an object that I have overlapping one another, and that's always a good compositional idea. If you have two objects that just meet, it's very hard for your eye to move away from that tension point where they do meet. So something that's kind of a compositional standard of mine is to overlap shapes so you have a way to flow through them. But when you're drawing, it's very difficult to get an accurate drawing if you don't actually draw through the shape. And so when I'm looking and imagining what's occurring to that pear which is overlapped, what I'll do is go ahead and draw through the shape so that where it meets the table edge or the cloth edge, it feels natural. Sometimes pears aren't the most interesting shapes in the world, and so I'll look for things that I can do to embellish them. In this case, when I look at the pears and see if there are any interesting defining characteristics, I might, for instance, make one of the curves a little knobbier, so to speak, than it is. Looking at this shape here, I think it'd be more interesting if I made this curve out a little bit more, in a little bit more, just moving and adjusting what I see to have a little more effective composition. From this point, I think I have a workable drawing, but of course I don't want pencil lines that are this dark or disruptive because I don't want them to show through in the finished painting. So what I'm going to do now is simply grab a kneaded eraser, and of course I can get rid of the line that I drew through since I've already used it as a guide. I can get rid of any of the distracting pencil lines where I've adjusted or modified the shape. And for that matter, I've got the composition blocked in. I know what I'm going to do. I know that I'm going to have a light background, and I'll explain that in a minute. And I don't think I need any pencil lines at all. So the pencil sketch increasingly for me is a way of working out the ideas. And then for the most part, since I'm not trying to draw between the lines or anything, it's not a paint by number, I get rid of what I don't need and start fresh from there. I think I'm ready to start painting. So I'm going to make sure that I've added enough water to my palette that I can cover the sheet without having to go back in because I don't want to be wasting time on this. And I'm going to start with a light yellow wash, which basically approximates some of the light values that I see in the pears anyway. The pears happen to be pretty green. They're not very ripe and not very interesting as far as I'm concerned, so I'm probably going to warm up the color a little bit anyway. Just that cold green that I see there isn't the most attractive thing in the world, so I'll probably be adding a little more orange and ochre as if they were a little riper. One of those things you can do from having painted tons of pears is modify them. And that right there is a pretty simple warm to cool background wash. There's not much to it, but then there's not much to what I'm seeing, so I think that'll do. Now that the background's dry and we're ready to start painting the pears themselves, we still have a little bit of a house cleaning task to take care of, and that's getting ready to paint by having all the color on our palette. And so now I'm going to observe the pears. The first thing I can see is that I'm going to need a lot of yellow ochre. That yellow ochre is going to be darkened on the shadow side by a dark violet. In this case, it's one of the darkest colors on my palette, a carbazole violet. And I'm going to draw a lot of that color out because it's going to be used extensively on the shadow side. I think I'm going to change the cast of the pears away from that green that I see towards a little bit more of a yellow ochre orange. So add a little bit of orange to that mix, take out more of the yellow ochre and start adding it to the violet mix. I want to just approximate the mixes that I need because if I mix them all together on my palette, then I don't have any range of colors to choose from, and that would kind of defeat the point. So what I'm going to do is mix some of them together that I know will be mixed eventually anyway, and otherwise just continue drawing out what I hope is a substantial amount of color. And the last thing, because it's so intense and I didn't want to dirty my water beforehand, is getting a bit of phthalo blue, which is the deepest staining color on my palette, and it's tough to get that off of any of your other paints. And so whenever I use phthalo blue, I try to make sure I either use a very clean brush, making sure that I've gotten all of the blue out of it, or I just wait until the end. All right, so now I think I'm ready to start applying color to both of the pears. At this point, I'm not going to finish them to completion in one shot and I don't think I'll try to separate the shapes in this stage here. So what I'm going to do is paint through the forms and model the two together as much as I can, and then I'll separate them in another stage. Something that this does besides speeding up the process is unify the two to a degree, because you're using some of the same colors across the pears, and therefore there's a bit of a relation color-wise one to the other. And here, initially, what I'm simply doing is toning down the pears and being pretty careful. I mean, inside the pear, it doesn't matter. In areas where there are no boundaries, nothing occurring, I can be as sloppy or messy as I want. And I'm going to switch to a bit smaller brush and just start blocking in some of the darks that I see where the shadow plane is separating itself from the light plane. And again, as I need to, if I'm sure that I don't have to look up and refer to something for a minute, I'll turn the paper upside down to paint the edges a bit better. All right, at this point, you might be looking at the pears and thinking, well, they're not very developed yet, and I look at them and I see the same thing, but there's no reason they need to be at this stage. When I look back and forth, you should always be looking not so much at whether your painting is as far advanced, whether it's done, whether it's developed, but look at it in relation to what you see in the actual object, and if nothing is any glaring error, for instance, I don't see any darks that are too dark, certainly, because there aren't any. I don't see any highlights that are missing. The values seem to be basically in the right place, although not as dark yet, and so I think I'm ready to carry on. Now, the application that I used for that first stage is one that I could certainly continue with, but there's also no reason that you can't start to model and soften edges in smaller areas without wetting the entire shape. So what I'm doing here is starting to refine just to a small degree the form that I see in front of me, and while I'm doing so, I'm putting down a little bit of color and gradually wetting the surface. I'm at that funny stage where the paper is kind of wet, it's kind of dry, and I think that the mottled surface of the pears will benefit from that variance in the texture of the paper. As I look down at this, I think that doesn't really look very good. But I squint my eyes and I look at what's occurring there, and I squint my eyes and I look at my painting, and there's really no problem. I just need to carry through. I should quit goofing around with these halftones and maybe get to some real darks in the shadow plane. That's better. You can paint by adding paint, which is the usual way, and you can also paint by taking paint away. And I'm still looking and wondering whether that highlight needs to be a little lighter or whether it's okay. If it needs to be a little lighter, what I'll generally do is clean my brush, dip it into the water, tap my sponge, touch the surface of the paper, and lift up the color. You could also blot with a paper towel. There are as many ways of taking care of the addition or subtraction of paint as there probably are watercolor painters, although there are some ways which are more standard than others. And so I'm adding some flecks of, basically kind of a dirty yellow ochre orange mix to begin suggesting some of the texture on that side. All right, after looking at what I've done and reflecting on it, I think that it seems to be coming along okay, but I've done a little bit of painting between the ears, which is always a good thing. And after looking at what I had going on with this relatively bland green color scheme in front of me, not that there's anything wrong with that, the close values and the close colors can be interesting, I think what I'm going to do is simply start to do a simple foreground. And why am I using such a small brush? I don't know. Switch to a larger brush. and begin to indicate it. I think the choice of a warm red-orange is more effective than that green cloth that I see. And I'm also thinking that since the shapes of the pears join that cloth, why not go ahead and paint the light cloth right now, and that will eliminate the problem of the darks running into it later on, although I can be careful, of course, and avoid that like I am here. But giving your objects a resting place, something to sit on, does so much for their completion as well. And so simply indicating that, yes, this is some kind of fabric or backdrop or cloth that they're sitting on is going to make the pears themselves feel more effective. Again, it's one of those things where you often can complete something and make it look better, not by completing the object itself, but by completing what's around it. And so I'm adding some of my dirty purple again. It's mostly this carbazole violet that I use a lot, to the oranges already on my palette, and starting to suggest the turns and folds of the cloth. Darker on the right, wet on wet, adding color, and now where it's important to adjust it, lifting the color where the light's falling along the top plane of the shelf. I'll take paint out of my brush, dip in, dry it a bit on the sponge or paper towel, and go back and lift it. Do that all the way along the edge, because I've got too much water there right now for the kind of control that I want. There are more variables between wet paint, dry paint, wet brush, dry brush, wet paper, dry paper, humidity, heat. There are more variables in watercolor than any other medium. Now, thinking in terms of that value shift that I see from left to right, lighter on the left, darker on the right, I'm going to let this top area on the right let a little more of the dark values of my paint slip in there. And at this point I can start to drop color in to indicate, for instance, the shadow side of a fold or two. And that may or may not be complete, but I think it's reading okay, and I probably won't know for sure until after I finish the other pear and look at it again. So I think at this point you can probably see just what that did to give the pears something to sit on, and I think I'm ready to move on to the second pear.